So I'm going to talk about ethics and governance in the context of the banking sector. There are a number of issues that we've seen in the banking sector globally recently. The first issue has been issues of rogue traders. In, I think, the 1990s in Singapore, we had a gentleman named Nick Leeson who worked for the Barings Bank. Okay? And what Nick Leeson was doing was, he worked in a merchant bank, a Scottish merchant bank, and head office is in Scotland, and he's operating in Singapore, and he is in effect taking very risky practices to his speculation on markets. He's concealing his speculation through company documents, concealing this from head office. That the bank really didn't have the internal means of control, the balances and checks that are needed to keep people who are encouraged to do this speculating, to make sure you have those checks and balances to check up on them. Now, at the same time, we've seen a very similar issue more recently in the French bank, Societe Generale, Soc Gen, Jerome Cavale, very similar issues, some 15 or 20 years later. Now, I think the important thing that the banking sector's got to think about at times with this is that the performance rewards that they put on people that are doing trading in speculative merchant banking activities are consistent with the values that they want. So if they reward people in ways that don't align with what they say they want, well, I think they're then going to get the behaviour that they reward financially. Okay, so obviously one of the biggest recent issues has been the global financial crisis. And what we saw in the global financial crisis is a backdrop of deregulation, particularly in the American banking sector. With deregulation came enormous increase in competition. With increased competition, we had the lowering of borrowing standards and lending standards. And what the Americans called it was subprime mortgages. Now, in effect, if I'd been offered one of these mortgages and been deemed a subprime customer, I might have been a little insulted. But what they were doing was they were really lending money to people that realistically couldn't afford to pay it back. Okay? They were then packaging up these loans and putting them out onto the stock exchange and on-selling them to other financial institutions. So when the people who were lent the money who couldn't afford to repay, when they defaulted on mortgage repayments, etc., then what we saw in the financial system was this kind of popping of kind of hot air of systems. There was money on paper that they thought they were going to make, and then suddenly that money disappears. So at the same time, what we've seen is, particularly in America. Now we've been a bit lucky in Australia because we haven't deregulated to the same degree. In America, a savings bank can also operate a merchant bank. So you can have a savings bank that has mum and dad type savings and investments, and it also has a more speculative merchant banking arm. So in America, what the banks were doing was that they were raising this money out of mum and dads and normal investors, and then they were being extremely speculative with it. And we saw a number of merchant banks collapse as a result of the GFC. And what this does is it takes enormous money from normal people with retirement, superannuation, pension plans, etc., investors. Their money is in effect lost by these banks. Another issue we saw with this deregulation has been the privatisation of credit rating agencies, where we often have this, we had fairly incestuous relationships between the credit rating agencies, the banks and government, where people would work across all three types of institutions and just cycle between them. So we have this kind of culture of understanding and perhaps a bit of group think, that they've all been trained in this kind of way of thinking about banking. And this is particularly in America. So what the credit rating agencies were doing was they were rating these loans, giving them very high credit ratings, that they rated them as, cast iron products. And then what happened was they exploded. These air pockets dissipated throughout the market. So there's questions now as to how well the credit agencies are actually really functioning, given that they've now been privatised. I think the issue I want to come back to is in Australia, generally, you don't have a savings bank that also has a merchant bank. They're not the same thing. They don't have the two functions. Savings banks will have merchant banking arms, but they are a little bit separate and removed, so they're not exactly the same thing. So I think we've seen a few interesting things in the industry. I think we've seen issues of rogue traders. We've got to be careful about the behaviour that we reward, so that we're not rewarding people for highly risky behaviour, and we're not having the internal means of checking up on making sure that they're behaving professionally and appropriately. We've had the GFC and these kind of air pockets of bad loans floating throughout the financial system, and then we've had deregulation and increased competition. And some have talked about in banking that what we saw was the ethical race to the bottom.